and I'm gonna look at the YouTube stream and see if it's streaming. And I think we're live. I think we're live. Yay! Are we? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. God, every time I'm just like, oh God, like I don't know. We'll find out. Okay. And then I'm gonna post this on my Twitter and be like, everyone, I'm really excited about the discussion that we're having today, because I was like reading this and I was just like vibing. I was like, oh wow, like this is great. So I'm gonna post this on Twitter. I've got a nice Twitter thingy set up as post. That's getting ready. Twitter book club is happening right now. We're having a great discussion on colonization today. So check it out. Check it out. So check it out.
Check it out.
Check it out.
Oh, it's still on left ear? Oh no. Oh no.
I should have done this before I started streaming. Whatever. And if you'd like to join, donate to my Patreon. Okay. So that has no grammatical errors. I'm going to tweet that. It's tweeted. It's happening. It's official. All right. So, welcome to book club. For anyone who is watching, we are reading still The Wretched of the Earth by Franz, Fanon. And today we are reading on national culture. It was a really good chapter. It was one that I could really relate to. I feel like all the chapters in this book are good. But this is one where I was like, yes. I was like reading, I was like, yes. And I was underlining like everything. I was like, yes, I can relate to this. So I'm really excited to talk about it. Before we dive in, I want people watching this to know that, or if anyone is watching this, there's a few people watching. Hopefully the audio is good. No one said that it's bad, so that's a good sign. But for anyone who's watching this, if you would like to watch these book club streams later, they're going to be listed in a playlist on my channel called Book Club. They're not going to be found in the regular videos because I don't want them to kind of get cluttered up there. But they're going to be there. And before we get started, does anyone want to mention any channels they have or other projects they're working on that they would like to promote? Okay, well, I'll just go ahead.
Episode
Saber.
4. Wait. We just did episode 4 of our How Europe Underdeveloped Africa book club thing, which should be up some point next week. So go ahead and subscribe to Bread Theory.
Bread Theory. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's awesome.
We also did a recording of Pan-Africast, which will be coming out soon. TM. But it will also be on Bread Theory, so you can check it out there whenever it comes up.
Awesome. And if you guys want to leave a link to that in the voice text chat, and I'll put that in the description for the video here.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Sam, do you want to promote your writing?
Yeah, I write for Medium. My name's Sam Young. I haven't really written anything on Africa for a while. I've been trying to write something on Rojava, and it's like really hard to research for, so I've been doing that for like the past week, so I haven't really written very much, but yeah, sometimes I write on Africa.
Yeah, didn't you just write an article like on the first like libertarian socialist? Yeah. That was really good.
Oh yeah, I'm the shock. Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Sam's writing is really great. It's very educational and very engaging, which I find is like not always the case. Like sometimes you're reading stuff that's educational and it's like very like hard to get through, but Sam is both. He's very engaging and educational, and I love it. So definitely sign up to Medium and follow his articles. Anyone else have anything that would like to talk about or promote they're working on? All right, let's dive in. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take a look at this. We're going to take a look at that, which is The Wretched of the Earth. So this section is called On National Culture. And basically, I feel like what this section is about is, I feel like Fanon is critiquing this kind of like Pan-Africanism, Electing, like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I feel like you know a lot more about this, like, being a Pan-Africanist, where he's kind of talking about how there's this, like, black identity that is emerging, where people talk about this, like, very general, like, black identity. Like, there's black people in America, and there's obviously African black people. And I think Fanon is saying, like, that identity is ultimately limited because black identities are so diverse. Like, he has this great quote that we'll talk about that talks about, like, I forgot the name of these people, but, like, the first president of Senegal versus, like, Langston Hughes, like, who's an American writer. Like, these are both black people, but they have very different realities. And so I think he's saying that these black cultures and black identities need to be on the national level. And then he kind of ends by saying that those national identities are a resistance to colonization, and that kind of resistance, I think, is like kind of like the finest expression of culture. I think something like that. I might have just butchered that a little bit, but that's kind of my general take on it, and we'll dive in and clear up any of that if I missed it, if I did butcher that a little bit. So the first note I have is colonialist racism has guaranteed that underdeveloped countries will not be seen as legitimate, and I feel like that's a no-brainer at this point. Like we've been talking about this past few weeks that like colonialists, the other colonialist countries are going to do whatever they can to be like, oh look, like they're decolonized, but like look at how awful they're doing. They clearly need to be colonized, so you know that's going on. And then he kind of brings in a new term, which is colonized intellectuals. So he defines these people as a cultured class that recognizes a national culture and the right to exist. The colonized intellectual is aware that they could be trapped in Western culture, so they turn to the furthest away from colonialism. So I was fascinated by this because I was like, oh shit, like that's literally me. I feel really awkward. I'm like, oh god, like it's totally describing me. Like,
I'm in this tweet and I don't like it.
Yeah, I was like, oh shit. But yeah, let's dive into some of those quotes. There's a lot of things I've underlined about that, and I think it starts off in 147 when he kind of starts to dig into that. So yeah, I'm just gonna start reading this quote that's on 148. It's like in the bottom. So he says, reclaiming the past does not only rehabilitate or justify the promise of a national culture, it triggers a change of fundamental importance in the colonized psychoaffective equilibrium. Perhaps it has not been sufficiently demonstrated that colonialism is not content merely to impose its law on the colonized countries present and future. Colonialism is not satisfied with snaring the people in its net of or of draining the colonized brain of any form of substance. What a kind of perverted logic, it turns its attention to the past of the colonized people and distorts it, disfigures it, and destroys it. This effort to demean history prior to colonization today takes on a dialectical significance. So the reason why I'm reading that quote is because Fanon is talking about how colonized people, or the colonizers basically end up destroying like the history of the people who are colonized. Oh, wait. Hold on, am I streaming? Yeah, I am. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I already went through that, but I was like, wait. But like the colonizers end up just destroying the history of the colonized and go like, these people have no culture, like they're barbaric, we're saving them. And so the colonized intellectual basically starts to explore that history and goes like, hold on, like there's actually like a lot of really important stuff going here culturally. And it's also like the furthest away from colonialism. And basically Fanon ends up saying that I'm kind of like jumping around a lot. I feel like I don't know if I'm like reading enough, because like he says this throughout like a few pages, but like Fanon I feel like ends up saying that that doing this process, like going back and like clinging on to the past, isn't that helpful, because ultimately like our cultural identity is in fighting colonialism. Does that sound right to you guys? Does it sound like I'm missing something? Does anyone have anything to add or critique about that?
I'd say it sounds pretty much accurate. Wherein, like it to me, I'd say this this specific part, this on national culture is kind of describing the process of kind of the evolution of the colonized intellectual, where they kind of move from like one state to the next, and he kind of describes three different states. And just to quickly address something that you mentioned before, it's funny that you mentioned Pan Africanism, because the very first quote that Fanon makes in this section is from Sekou Touré, which is one of the fathers of modern Pan Africanism. Actually, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, their ideology is incrementism, Touréism. So what he is kind of critiquing when he says that there's this national culture that the colonized intellectual develops, the problem with it isn't necessarily that, say for example, it's trying to be this internationalist culture, but more so that they're trying to lead the culture rather than being a part of it. They're trying to develop a culture that isn't actually truly of the people, but is reaching in the past for one that had existed beforehand, rather than looking at one that sorry, that was my dryer. Rather than looking for one that is currently in the existing sort of colonized psyche.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think he calls them the latecomers. I think where he says, I can't remember the exact. Let me see if I can put it up real quick. All that has made up the technique of passive resistance in the past may, during this phase, be radically condemned. In an underdeveloped country during this period of struggle, traditions are fundamentally unusable and are shot through the centrifugal tendencies. This is why the intellectual often runs the risk of being out of date. The peoples who have carried on the struggle are more and more impervious to demagogy, and those who wish to follow them reveal themselves as nothing more than common opportunists, in other words, latecomers. But yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the same idea. Not 100% sure, but yeah, kind of another thing that comes to mind when I think about this is how kind of tragic it is that like colonialism just straight up just destroys like human history in general, not just the history of colonized people. So it's like, wow, when you kind of learn about like what people were capable of, it's like, wow, this is some amazing stuff. And yeah, to see that it all just gets quite literally like whitewashed or just ignored and it completely is just kind of, yeah, it's kind of tragic. I don't know how else to really put it. But yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like the other day someone was like, European history is like the best, and I was like, is it the best? Because like, they colonize like everybody, you know. I mean, if you like that, it's great, it's fine. But like, I mean, it is very fascinating. Like I've been listening to these like lectures on just like on like European. It's fascinating stuff, but then it's also like the rest of the world is also really fascinating. And when countries are colonized, like history like literally just gets lost. Like people groups get wiped out, languages are lost. Like it's really extreme that it's gone forever. Like things that have lasted for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it just makes me like really upset to read it. And then he also talks about how like I think we're getting to this, but like he talks about how basically like the double consciousness that happens like when he has like when people are like I'm like French Algerian, or like they have like these two like dueling identities that are like conflicting against each other. And he talks about how like the colonized intellectual has that. And I was like, that's so true. And it's just like very sad to like try to like your identity to like basically like if you're a colonized person, like you'll often have these like two conflicting identities. And I don't know if this is exactly what Fanon's talking about or if I'm just like projecting, but like I feel really weird that like for like other like cultures to gain legitimacy, you kind of have to view it through the lens of like white anthropology. Like when people are learning about indigenous people, like you know, like a lot of people like look down on those cultures and you know, but then like when an anthropologist is like, oh, like they have like this sacred ritual, and then like through the eyes of a white anthropologist it's like a legitimate thing now, then I've always just like found that like really frustrating, because it's like it can't just be these own people having their own way of life and that being legitimate. Like, you have to have a white anthropologist like talk about it in a way that white people can understand. And like, I appreciate anthropologists and what they do. So this isn't me like hating on anthropologists. It's more like hating on just, you know, colonization and how like things just aren't legitimate on their own unless you have like a white person legitimizing it. And it just really sucks. And yeah, like when he talks about like the like the colonized intellectual, like I just feel so like, I'm like, wow, like that whole process is like exactly what I'm going through right now. And like, and then he's like, then the intellectual realizes that like you can't really like have like, you know, like keep on talking about the past. Like you have to like focus on like the culture right now. And I was like, oh wow, that's like literally what I'm going through, like step by step. Like he just like read me like a book, and he's not even like alive, and like he just knew that's what I'm going through. I was like, whoa. But yeah, any more thoughts on that stuff before we're moving on?
Kind of reminds me of something that my friend is doing with Rapa Nui, which is like the native like way of calling Easter Island. Like there's like this there's this text that like existed on the island that used to be used natively, and then like the Spanish came over and basically they took like all of the educated people who like knew how to write in this text, and they like moved them to, I think, Chile, and I think all of them like died in slavery. So like nobody knows how to read this like language anymore, or this text, because like they're all gone. And like there's kind of this like conflict between, I guess, like people on the islands don't necessarily just seem to be like that interested in like the text anymore. It seems to be more of like this, I guess maybe this like white academic thing that like, you know, people want to come in, they want to figure out like, you know, what's written down here. But like a lot of the natives, they are kind of like moving beyond like this kind of like this idea of the past. And it's kind of like interesting that you have like this conflict here where there are like certain people who do like really find this like they really do care about like this like past and this idea of like, oh, there used to be, you know, this great society or whatever. But like there are also people who are like, they don't really care. I mean, I think that happens in every culture where it's just like, you know, the younger generation, they want to have their own identity and they want to separate themselves from their parents and they want to move on. So I feel like every culture has that tension. It's just, it becomes very exacerbated when you have like somebody come in and basically like destroy the old culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder, there's this person named Silver Spook who is Hawaiian, and like he just has so much to say about Hawaii and like liberating Hawaii right now. I feel like he'd be perfect for this discussion, but it's just like whenever he talks, it's just amazing because he's just like so focused on like what's going on right now, and I think that's really incredible. But yeah, I've always been like fascinated because like I don't know, I also was like adopted, but like I know that like a lot of Black Americans don't know exactly like what like I don't know even like what specific areas they're from, like because we're all just kind of like we just lost that history, so it's like we can't take like pride in a specific group of people often. Like if you go to like ancestry.com, you're like, oh, it's like you're probably from like maybe like this general area, so it's like yeah. But I've always been like jealous of indigenous people in the US because like they still have like something specific to hold on to, even though like obviously like I'm not jealous of like the tragedy that they went through, but I'm just jealous that they can like be like, oh, like I'm Danae, and hold on to those traditions and stuff. And but also like reading this kind of is like, well, that would be really nice, and also like focusing on the kind of like the struggle of colonization now is where our culture is at. It just kind of like makes me feel like a little bit less sad about that, because I think I felt really like, yeah, I think I was like having some like identity crisis with that and stuff. So yeah. So the next thing I wrote is colonization distorts the past of the colonized and accuses them of having no culture and needing saving, which we discussed. However, there's no going back. Colonialism destroyed much of that culture, which we also discussed. Culture is important in order to exert the right to exist. Ooh, definitely want to touch on that. So I wrote that. I have a quote on 150. So, okay. I need to like be better with my quotes because there's like the whole page is like underlined. But this is 150, kind of top of the page. Colonialism, little troubled by nuances, has always claimed that. Oh, I don't know if I can say this on YouTube. I can, right? Well, I don't know if it'll get taken down. I don't know. I don't know if I can say the N word on YouTube.
I know. I
don't know.
I don't if you want to try.
I'm just gonna say the N word, but I feel really lame. I just don't know if it'll get taken down, but it's like this video will have a bunch of views anyways. I'm just like, I don't know. So, claimed the N word was a savage, not an Angolan or Nigerian, but an N word. For colonialism, this vast continent was a den of savages, infested with superstitions and fanaticism. I'm going to skip down a little bit because I remember the part that I really wanted to read. So the culture proclaimed is African. When the black man, who has never felt as much of a Negro as he has under white domination, decides to prove his culture and to act as a cultivated person, he realizes that history imposes on him a terrain already snapped out, that history sets him along a very precise path, and that he is expected to demonstrate the existence of a Negro culture. Like, that quote really resonated with me, especially when it says that when a black man who's never felt as much of a Negro as he has under white domination, I was like, yeah, like, you know, people were just, like, people, like, yes, in their own respective cultures, but, like, it was being around, like, for me, for example, like, being around white people was when I realized that I was black. Like, I started off life just being like, oh, I'm just a person, you know, like, as we all do. And then as you get older, you're like, oh, wait, like, I'm a boy, or I'm like this or that, and this is what this means. But I learned that I was black by being around white people, and I think my situation is like a little bit unique because I was adopted in a white family, and I grew up around white people, so I'm interested to hear what, like, people think here who have, like, the black people here who grew up around black people, like, was it like being in your family where you realized you're black, or was it like being around white people? But for me, it was like I was around white people and I was like, oh, like, I'm black. And then also being black was like, you don't have a culture besides like gangster rap. And I was like, what? And people like thought that people would like, when as a kid, like, kids thought I was like maybe like from the hood, and I'm like, no, I grew up like just in this like white suburb that you grew up in. And people were like, really? And I'm like, yeah. Because like people's idea of what it meant to be black was like projected on me, and that's when I learned what it meant to be black, and it's like through white domination. So yeah, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
I think for me, it's hard to say like the first instance, but there's some general things that kind of come to mind. I suppose like living in the UK and having like family that are pretty closely tied to Africa, to the continent still, to the African continent still. There have been like very very interesting like moments where like more so like as I sort of entered into when I first started working, for example. Like in my late teens, right? Working in a predominantly like a white workforce, I guess. And just like hearing like very strange like subtle comments here and there. And I'm just like, wait, like where is this coming from? Like why is the butt of every or most of the jokes that these people find funny have to do with has to be at the expense of like non-white people in general, and I always just found that so strange. And then I kind of just like thought back to situations in like, oh,
at the expense.
Wait, sorry, how? Yeah, at the expense of either black people or non-white people in general. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and then that sort of caused me to reflect on earlier instances in like school and stuff like that, and just sort of seeing these things, or just remembering these things that had happened, whether they've been by like other students or by teachers and stuff like that, and yeah, like because I don't know whether the ties that I have to the continent had any like, well, I can't. It's very hard to gauge the actual the impact of that, but it does seem like that kind of made me much more resilient, I guess, because I kind of like, I don't know, it seemed like as I got older and as I started to learn more about like where I was from and stuff like that, I was like, okay, these people are saying these things, but like it literally is not true. There's no like, you know, the idea that that like we have no culture, and like the day before, for instance, or a couple of days before, there's been a party, a family gathering at my house where we're dancing to like African music and stuff like that, and it's like, yeah, like the I don't know. Like, it's such a good. I don't know. It's such a good question. It's such a good question for Into Flowers. Oh my god. All right. So yeah, it seems like having direct content or direct contact with my African culture has helped me to like push back against a lot of the nonsense that people have tried to say or try to use to like denigrate like African history and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, I'd have to like think about that more because that's a good question.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder because the family that I grew up in was like very like they thought that their whiteness was gonna like make me a better person, and like so I'm also half Chinese, and my family would really focus on that. They'd be like, oh, like here's a Chinese doll and stuff, and like, but like whenever black stuff came up, they just didn't really want to talk about it. And I remember as a kid, I was like, I love black sounding names, like I think they sound really beautiful. And I said it to my parents, and they were like, "Oh no, like you don't want a black sounding name." And I was like, "Why?" And they're just like, "Oh, you just don't." They didn't really explain it much, and like now I understand why, because they're racist. Like, and I didn't have like parents who were like, "Yeah, like you're black and you should be proud of that. Like that's awesome." Like my parents were like, you know, they were like, "You're black, and like you know, being black is fine." But then when stuff about black culture came up, they were like, "Yeah, that stuff's bad." Like they very much hated black culture and like didn't have an appreciation for it, and so like you know they weren't like obviously like they adopted a black kid, so they weren't like racist where they like thought black people were like inherently bad, but they were racist in the way where they thought their whiteness was going to make me a better person and thought black culture was just like trash and there was nothing to salvage there. So I think growing up in a family where like you know like you're like have like family from like Africa and like you're just like hanging out, having a good time, and you can be like, yeah, that stuff's just bullshit. And I think even like Black American families, like it sounds like there's like a lot of stuff that you grow up like really loving, and so it's like when people say racist stuff, you can just be like, that's just not true. That white people are really racist. Wow. But for me, I was like, oh, maybe it is true because like I didn't know any black people, and then I grew up and it was like, oh wait, this is all just racism. So
Yeah, yeah. Another thing too is that like it definitely took some time to fully like embrace the heritage and stuff like that. Because I do remember like being like really young and then not wanting to really engage with like let's so for instance here this will be a typical setup. All right, I'll give you the inside scoop of quote unquote Black British parties and stuff like that, families and stuff like that. So let's say so we go to gathering in someone's house. Typically, like the living room area would be where the adults are usually talking about something their past stuff like that, or dancing to music, usually like African music or something like that. And then the younger generation would be like just like in the room playing games and stuff like that. And I remember like specific moments where they're trying to like get us to come inside and like come into like engage with them, and we're like, no, we're over here playing FIFA, blah blah blah, and they're like, all right, why don't you come and play some of your music, and then I'd come in and try and play like I'd recommend McFly or something, something like that. Sorry, yeah, one of these like white boy bands, and they're all looking at me like, you can dance to this stuff, and I'm just like, no, we just kind of sit there and like listen, and I just remember I have those memories because it seems so random, but like I remember having those kind of thoughts, and then over time, just like embracing the African side more and more, and like thinking back to those times and being like, yeah, no, that was like, I don't know how the hell I would have like danced to like a McFly song, just jumping around or whatever, but yeah, so like it was those kinds of things that was constantly getting me to like look inwards and be like, all right, so why is it that I don't like this music? Why don't I like this as African music? Why don't I like hearing about this kind of stuff, and so it really got me to challenge that. So I can only imagine like what it would be like for someone who isn't surrounded by that. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been weird. It's been weird. Anyone have anything else to add before we move on? All right. So the next thing I wrote is Black people are only unified in that Black people contrast their identity with, I said us, I meant to say white people, which we kind of just talked about. But basically, to break down that quote, or like to break down that statement, like, I think Fanon is saying like the common thread between Black people like across the globe is that Black people are like no matter where you are, like you're going to be contrasted, your Blackness is going to be contrasted with whiteness, and like that kind of is the thing that can bring all Black people across the globe together, because like, you know, so many, you know, Black nations are colonized, and like it's like this experience of just, you know, like contrasting what it means to be Black with what it means to be white. And so like we're kind of like in that similar negative position. But other than that, like there's just so much diversity in different nations, like so much diversity. And so I think he's just saying that needs to be acknowledged. He talks about the word negritude, and so it's kind of just like this general Blackness, I don't know if that's too general of a definition for negritude, but he kind of like just talks about like, because I don't want to say it's Pan-Africanism, but just kind of like the blanket statement of like Black people, or there's like these like common like threads through Black people, but it's like very, very, it's just too general. I think he's like critiquing negritude as being too general of a statement or view. And then he gives the example of Arab people. So the continental cultural identity, or negritude, erases Arabs, for example, who identify as Arabs, not as a monolith with all Black people. So the continental view of negritude is misleading. Any thoughts on that?
Well, just as far... Oh, sorry.
Oh no, just real quick. In terms of like negritude, it kind of reminds me of. I think this is something that like Aimé Césaire was into. I think the person who wrote Discourse on Colonialism, which is interesting because like he was one of Fanon's inspirations. So I'm kind of curious to kind of like maybe look into that a bit more to see the disagreements that he may have had with that. But yeah, that's all really. Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Just as far as reading about like Syria recently, the Ba'ath Party, like which is kind of both like there's like the iteration in Iraq with Saddam, and then there's also the Syrian guy. Okay, sorry, I'm tired today. But yeah, basically, like they have like this very strong pan-Arabist identity, and this idea of like, okay, everybody needs to be like, we have to have this overarching like Arab identity, and that's actually really bad for a lot of the minority groups who don't identify as Arabs, notably the Kurds. The Kurds don't consider themselves to be Arabs, and like the Arabs don't really consider the Kurds to be Arabs either, and like a lot of like the Kurdish language and stuff like that, and like a lot of Kurdish culture was suppressed because this idea of like, okay, we need to have this pan-Arab identity, and like we don't need people who kind of like against that. And just for me, just kind of like reading a lot of this, I feel like a lot of these ideas are kind of fraught, and like he talks about like nationalism a lot, and I feel very skeptical about nationalism just because especially in the Arab world, where like there's a lot of diversity, and like a lot of like North African people, I remember talking to them and they're like, we are not Arab, don't call us Arab, like just don't do that, like we're definitely not Arabs. And like there's a lot of these people who really reject this idea of like, oh, we have like this even nationalism. A lot of people like, they don't, a lot of it is very contrived, and a lot of people like end up kind of being suppressed, or like they don't really get to have a voice because like they don't really fit into the structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like even like in that like situation, there's like even when we like talk about Arabs, there's so much diversity in Arabs. Like there's not like a single monolithic like Arab culture. And then yeah, there's like a lot of people that people would call Arabs and they're like we're not Arabs. So there's just like a lot of diversity in those things. Yeah, any other thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts, but like the thing that's come into my mind most strongly is that like I remember a section of this portion of the book on culture where they're talking about how there was this black group or union that was formed basically to be like a counter to the European like club or union or something, and then they had to break it down within that black union because they realized that like a lot of their struggles and stuff were too disparate. So then they had to like make their own. If somebody knows the section of the book that I'm talking about and like could highlight that particular section, please jump in. But basically, they had to hyper focus on just the particular problems that are within that region, within that nation. And listening to y'all's discussion, what came to my mind was how like in the U.S. and not to be like too U.S. centric, but I'm thinking of how like there were so many nations here before, and now like just this whole big thing is the U.S. So on the topic of like being skeptical of nationalism because a lot of voices are going to be left out and stuff like that, it's like I think that nations are just like too big, and if you reduce it to the amount that it can actually be representative of stuff, and then people won't get left out, then that's when I don't really have a problem with nationhood, the idea of it, because it's like I feel like we do need some methods of self-determination, which Fanon talks a lot about in the beginning parts of the book as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's speaking of the U.S., I think it's really fascinating because like I took this like indigenous class or indigenous like history class, and the teacher really tried to focus on what it was like before colonialism, not just during and after. And it's really silly, but this thing struck me where I was like, all these different groups of people did not see themselves as like a monolith, or like we think of like indigenous people now, but like the indigenous like nation that we have in the U.S. came because the colonists put all these indigenous people into boarding schools, and also like took away their land. And so on, and so then there became this kind of like unifying experience where it's like, okay, like there's still obviously there's different groups of people within that nation, but that's when it became like a nation of indigenous people because it was against colonialism. And the same thing with black slaves. There's so many different groups of people, and then just kind of getting shoved into slavery like became now we have like a black nation. And again, that's like specifically in contrast to colonialism. But yeah, there's so much diversity there, and it that definitely needs to be recognized. Anything else to add before we move on? I guess we're also running. We'll just try to speed things up a little bit since we're running out of time. So, next I wrote about the thing about Langston Hughes and Richard Wright, who are American writers, and so they have a very different experience from Leopold Senghor, the first president of Senegal, and Kenyatta, the first minister of Kenya. So black culture for Fanon must be national because it more national as opposed to like continental, because it more accurately represents the different black cultures. The colonized intellectual develops two conflicting identities. That's kind of what I was talking about, like double consciousness and the whole like I'm a black American, for example, or like someone being like I'm a French Algerian. Like people have these like two identities that are conflicting because like one's the colonized and one's the colonizer. So he talked about the three stages of the colonized writer. The first stage is that they prove that they have assimilated to white culture. The second stage is the study of pre-colonialism. The third stage is they realize that a nation exists not through culture, but the struggle against colonialism, and that is the culture, essentially. And let me finish up reading these notes and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, Fanon says the colonized artist creates art that ends up stereotyping. The creator paints what is in the past and irrelevant to the future. If the colonized writer writes for the past, they must also write to create a future. So I guess let's just talk about that a little bit. The idea of the struggle against colonialism is not through understanding the past culture, or I wish I had like a better quote. I'm sure there's a quote somewhere, but we're just running a little bit short on time. But the idea that like the national culture that like people have is the struggle against colonialism, and he says somewhere that is like the finest like form of culture. And I don't remember if that's in this section or the next section, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm a poet. Don't know if there are any other poets or poetry fans here, but this spoke to me a lot, like how Luo was saying that, you know, you see yourself, like Fanon is just calling you out. It was like, this is the whole thing right here, of, you know, the way that basically the poets who consider themselves revolutionary intellectuals in some sort or another will often get co-opted, made into like, you know, the poet laureate of the city or the state or the nation. And so then they're going through this whole process where they're like reconnecting back with their culture. They're like, you know, breaking apart from assimilation. And then suddenly like they're the voice that's representative of whatever the people are supposed to be saying. And a lot of it is ineffectual in a way that is hard to put a finger on, but I think that Fanon really nails it, in that, you know, there's a particular quote where he says that the art has to come after the struggle has already been, you know, initiated and is already going through, because, you know, the art that comes before is like bound to be a lot of rationalizations and justifications and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. I really feel like reading this chapter, like Fanon, like pointed out something that like I kind of like was like this doesn't seem right. I could something like seemed off about this and that, and like I feel like he really like is hitting the nail on the head here with like the idea of like focusing on past culture, and you know that not that doesn't have value, but the struggle needing to be like what's going on, and then like writing trying to like write a future as well, and that very much being connected with the struggle. Yeah, I really like that he talks about that.
This is giving me like Afrofuturist vibes, honestly.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Totally.
Yeah, because it kind of reminds me of, and again, I think we can all agree that Fanon is calling out all of the Africans in this voice call right now. But just based on this chapter, because it's like, yeah, like as you were saying before, and as Jeremy was saying too, yeah, there is that sense. And I remember like making video essays starting a couple years ago, right? Making just random videos about like the NHS and like I can't remember my other ones, like about like woke Hollywood and all this kind of stuff. And then I discover like Afrofuturism, and I'm like, all right, now there's like a massive shift in terms of not only focusing more on like African history, stuff like that, but then also trying to keep in mind the future. Like the whole point of this is to, you know, look at the future, learn from the future, and you know, be inspired, look at what went well, what could have been improved upon, and then to kind of, you know, project into the future a positive future that, you know, we're involved in, a liberating future that transcends beyond a lot of the suffering that we're dealing with today, stuff like that. So in that sense, Afrofuturism, even though, you know, the future's in the name, a big part of it is also looking at our history and seeing what we can you know, bring with us, or, you know, even leave behind. And kind of reminds me of also of a book that kind of fits into the Afrofuturist genre, I guess, and that is The Deep, which is about this underwater society of African mermaids who somehow like escape from slavery. It's a fictional book, obviously. I'll say that it's a fictional book.
It's fictional.
It's about, all right, so yeah, alternate universe whereby the misfortunes of the slave trade of pregnant African women being taken from the African continent to the so-called New World, and oftentimes being like thrown overboard because of the inconvenience of having a pregnant woman on your ship. And so in this story, it's about the offspring of these women surviving underwater, becoming mermaids, and then developing their society and culture. And like one integral part of it is trying to hold on to your history, and they develop entire like systems around like they have like one single historian who holds on to the memories for like the entire year and stuff like that. And like throughout that book, one of the themes that did kind of stand out to me, and something that is kind of ringing true in this section, is that even though as I said, right, even though history is important, very very important, you can't stay there. um, you have to be able to learn and apply to the current conditions that you're living under today. So yeah, those are a few things that I kind of found that kind of stood out to me in this section.
Yeah, I also find it very empowering because it's like, I in some ways he's like, listen, like this is like gone, which really sucks. But then he's like, we need to, like the struggle is where we're gonna find our culture, which is essentially like our, like not a reason to live. He says something like culture is, gosh, like not the argument to live, but like I don't know, culture is like people use culture to be like, this is why we deserve to be here, and so people like go to the past to be like, oh, look at this culture that we have, and then colonialism wiped out, and it's like, no, that culture that like says like we deserve to be here is actually right here in the struggle. And so to me that's like kind of a relief, because I think I very much focus on the past. Like I talk a lot about music a lot. I talk about like, even though like this is not quite the same, but like I get really sad about how like Black Americans have made like so much of the music that we have today, and but then people like just don't know. They just don't know. Like, and I get so sad because I'm like, people like K-pop, and then they like Koreans. They're like, yeah, I like K-pop, so I like Koreans and stuff. That just doesn't happen with Black music. Like people can listen to rock and roll and just think of British people, even though Black people are the ones who made that. Or like, electronic music, or just even like folk music. Like it's just like our history gets erased, and then I get really sad because I'm like, if people understood like how influential Black people were to the music they love, maybe they wouldn't hate us so much. Like maybe they would actually respect us. And I get really sad about it, and I kind of like hold on to the past, and I really like I talk about that a lot because I'm like so frustrated, and reading this chapter kind of, I mean, I'm still frustrated about that, but reading this chapter made me like a little less worried about like trying to convince white people of our past, and more kind of being like, okay, like where should I look about, like where are we struggling right now, like maybe focus my attention there. So I felt empowered by that like a lot. So we still have like the next part, and I'm just gonna mutual foundations for national culture and liberation struggles. We have like 5 minutes left. I'm just gonna run through this really fast. So oh, this is where he really talks about resistance to the culture is nationhood. And then he talks about national literature. So he says national literature is combat literature. It calls upon a whole people to join in the struggle for the existence of the nation. And then I had a question, but we're probably going to skip that. And it says, restoring national sovereignty is the greatest cultural manifestation that exists. After the struggle, there is the demise of colonialism, but also the colonized, which I feel like we did touch on. Well, okay, I'm going to ask this question because I actually am really curious. Like, I have no idea what this means. So, on 176, he says, the new jazz styles are not only born out of economic competition, they are one of the definite consequences of the inevitable, though gradual, defeat the Southern universe in the USA. And it is not unrealistic to think that in 50 years or so, the type of jazz laments hiccuped by a poor, miserable Negro will be defended by only those whites believing in a frozen image of a certain type of relationship and a certain form of negritude. I only read part of that quote, and I don't know if you guys remember that, but I was like kind of confused because it seemed like he was saying that like that whites will only remember like a specific kind of Negro when it comes to like jazz or other forms of art, and I just didn't understand like why he was saying that or like what that meant, because I was really curious about that. But I don't know if you guys caught that. It's on 176. It's like the first paragraph on that.
I didn't know we were supposed to read that part of the chapter, but I guess what it brings up for me is just kind of the idea that like right now jazz is really being codified in like music theory schools. So like Adam Neely is really big on this, where like he talks about jazz all the time, and there's like all these like massive like theory books and stuff like that. And there's sort of this idea of like, okay, like, back in the day when like jazz was coming up, then it was like people said very, very racist things about it. And like even like some of like the, philosophers would say like, okay, this is garbage, this is worthless. Like people were very negative towards it. But now that it's been kind of like codified, like they're actually kind of like adjusting like the way like people think intellectually about this music. But now we also kind of have like, I guess like rap music, which is kind of this like entirely new music, and then you have like Ben Shabibo saying like, okay, rap music isn't even music, right? We're not even going to acknowledge the idea that it is music. And now there's kind of this like new trend in the music theory scene where it's like, actually no, like this is actually, you're wrong, this is stupid, and like that's happening very slowly, but people are starting to try to like codify now like this new type of like rap music, and they're trying to like kind of figure out like, okay, like what's the theoretical way to like think about this, and that's like very much in its like infant stages. But I think like probably like 30 years from now, like people will be talking about like rap music theory as at least my kind of instinct on this.
Dissertation on Young Thug.
Exactly. I actually wrote one. I wrote a paper in college. Thug.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that, and it kind of bothers me because, I'm glad that people can go to school and, like, learn jazz and stuff, but it's kind of the thing I was saying about anthropology, where it's, like, once, like, a lot of the people, like, in schools for jazz are, like, these white musicians, and, isn't bad. I feel like the musicians I've met like really respect jazz and people who made it, but it's also like, yeah, like now jazz has a lot of validity because it's in the halls of white academia, so now it's like really valid. And when it came out, yeah, there's like this article was like, is there a sin in syncopation? And it's like, geez, like, yeah, I definitely like think that's happening, and I feel like Fanon's touching on something else. He's touching on like he says like the whites believing in a frozen image of a certain type of relationship and a certain form of negritude, like, so let me just read this thing. So it is the colonials who become the defenders of indigenous style, a memorable example and one that takes a particular significance because it does not quite involve a colonial reality, was the reaction of white jazz fans when, after the Second World War, new styles such as bebop established themselves. For them, jazz could only be the broken, desperate yearning of an old Negro, 5 whiskeys under his belt, bemoaning his own misfortune and the racism of whites. As soon as he understands himself and apprehends the world differently, as soon as he elicits a glimmer of hope and forces the racist world to retreat, it is obvious he will blow his horn to his heart's content, and his lucky voice will ring out loud and clear. The new jazz styles are not only born out of economic competition, they are one of the definite consequences of the inevitable, though gradual, defeat of the Southern universe in the USA, and it's not unrealistic to think that in 50 years or so, the type of jazz lament hiccuped by a poor, miserable Negro will be defended only by those whites believing in a frozen image of a certain type of relationship and a certain form of negritude. I wonder if he's saying, like, I don't know, but I wonder if he's, like, talking about, like, with, I I mean, I guess this does sound like what you were saying, Sam, and we'll wrap up in like just a few minutes, everyone. But I wonder if he's saying that like the white people who will end up defending jazz will only like defend like a specific type of image of negritude because and that's one of like this jazz musician who's like, you know, like a black person who's like drinking and is just really fucked up because he's a black person living in the US. And so like they'll just defend like that specific thing. The reason why I'm thinking that is because I feel like a lot of like jazz musicians that I have met like when I was in school, like I would like there was this one teacher who would like he was like he was a jazz musician, like an amazing, incredible guitarist, like just like fucking phenomenal. And but anyways, he was like this white person, but he like really hated on like rap and EDM. And you know, like black people have had a huge part in creating rap obviously, but EDM like was started off like in Detroit and then kind of like taken up in like Berlin and stuff, and like kind of came back to the US and like, but like there's like this very specific like he like revered like these black jazz musicians, and then in other types of music that he wasn't interested in, he just kind of still like looked down on these people and thought of them. It seemed like he thought of them as like riff rap, like if you were like into hip hop and stuff and like had that aesthetic, I think he would like look down on you. And I wonder if like Fanon is saying that like with the way that like white people defend cultures that they like they just do like that one very specific thing. Like I think he is saying that because he's talking about how like that like white people defend indigenous cultures, and then he like uses jazz, even though it's like, you know, not quite the same thing. But like I think so, because like when I also think of like white people defending indigenous culture, like I don't know if this is what he's talking about, because I'm thinking of like stuff now, and like he's back in like the 60s and 50s. But like when I meet people who like defend indigenous culture, who do it as like because they like the aesthetic or something, or because they're like into new agey stuff, they'll be like, yeah, like you know, indigenous people, like I like to burn like smudge and stuff like that, and I like to smudge, and I like their clothes and aesthetic and like their sexuality. And then in that very narrow way, they like really appreciate these indigenous people and will kind of defend them. But then also like in all the ways that it matters, like they're just not there. Like they're not like helping indigenous people like defend their land. They're just like not political at all. And there's like there's a very narrow way. And also a lot of those people like look down on indigenous people in Africa. Like they just like, I literally like dated this person who like really admired like indigenous people in America, and then he like talked about like the magic that people practice in Africa, even though it's like very diverse, and said it was bad, and it was black magic, you want to stay away from that. And I was like, fuck you. Just go fuck yourself. But like there's like this way where like people just like defend like a very narrow view of those cultures and whatnot, and it's like kind of annoying, honestly. Like I see that and I'm like, be a lot nicer if you actually just like really cared about these people and not just cared about like the fact that they like with indigenous people, like that if you just like cared more about the fact that like you like smudging, so you're gonna like defend indigenous people. I wish it went deeper than that. Or like you like jazz, so you like black jazz musicians, but you don't like black rappers, like you look down on them. It's like, I wish you could just connect the dots a little bit more and just stand up for all of us instead of like the one thing that you like. So I don't know if he's talking about that. It's hard to say. I got lost there. I like read that paragraph like 5 times. I was like, I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes me.
I agree, Lua. I think that's what he's saying. Yeah, if I could add to that a little bit, it just reminds me, like, recently my cousin, who's really into jazz, she showed me this playlist she had with Billie Holiday, and I was like, oh, Billie Holiday, that's the person who sang Strange Fruit, right? And she was like, yeah, she also has other songs. And so like I'm listening to it and I'm like, damn, she had some bops. Like, it's really true what he's saying, that like, once people get past like the initial thing, it's like the music changes and it evolves based on people's circumstances. So you have to take the whole thing into account and not just like have a frozen image of this is what the culture represents and I'm not going to let it expand beyond that.
Totally. And there's so much like great jazzy stuff in like hip hop, for example. Like I don't know, there's like some very like soulful hip hop that I just love, and I turn it on and like my mom would be like, turn that off, like it sounds like, she would just hear that's hip hop and be like, this is bad music, and I'd be like, this is like the most soulful stuff, like I can't believe you think this is bad just because you hear that it's hip hop, like it's so fucking wholesome. Like I don't know, there's like some really just, I don't know, yeah, it's like this, there's an evolution of things happening here, and I think that's really beautiful, and I wish people would be there for that. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up? Okay, so awesome. I'm gonna see if there's any Benoplusties here. It says, I wish I could be at this meeting. Y'all are great. Oh, thanks, Benoplusty. You're amazing. We got a heart in the chat. Someone says Happy Mother's Day. So yeah, Happy Mother's Day to you all. And I'm gonna end the stream here. If anyone's watching, thanks so much, and I'll see you in a